Hello everyone and welcome to this episode of the Crude Report. My name is Jim Washer, I'm Editor-in-Chief here at Argus, and with me today once again is Nader Itayim, our Editorial Manager in Dubai. So today we're looking ahead to next week's OPEC Plus meeting, which takes place against the backdrop of rising oil prices, growing political tensions between Russia, Europe and the US over Ukraine, but growing confidence also that the Omicron COVID-19 variant is not as dangerous as initially feared, and that the worst of the Omicron wave may in fact be over in some countries. So Nader, let's start with the market situation OPEC Plus is dealing with heading into next week's meeting. Prices already at their highest level since 2014 and looking like they could rise further. So what's behind this, and is it likely to continue?
Hi, Jim. Thank you. So that's right. OPEC Plus, it heads into these meetings with oil at its highest for around 7 years. I mean, it surpassed last year's highs of around 84. As we record this podcast, Brent has crossed the $89 per barrel mark, and it's really knocking on the door of 90. In terms of why this is happening, it seems to be down to like a confluence of several unfortunate events, shall we say. There's the fundamentals, and also, as you say, that, of course, geopolitics. With respect to the fundamentals, I mean, bottom line is we're seeing tightening balances. On demand, one of the main fears we had, say, 2 months ago when we were having this same chat, it was around, the Omicron variant that had just sort of burst onto the scene. I mean, there were concerns that it could be pretty severe and trigger another wave of restrictions and lockdowns around the world. And, that would have come all while supply was likely to increase, with OPEC Plus continuing to unwind its cuts. But fast forward to today, I mean, those fears have, at least for the most part, they've subsided. Although Omicron has proved to be sort of more contagious and transmissible than earlier variants, its severity on the whole is, much reduced. As a result, we've seen a softer response by many governments across the globe, although that hasn't really been the case, across the board. It's primarily been in the Northern Hemisphere where, governments are taking a more pragmatic approach, so we say. And they're really sort of staying away from the kind of serious restrictions and measures that we were seeing earlier in the pandemic. And yet, in places like China, we're seeing the total opposite. I mean, China is pressing ahead with its, its COVID zero policy, particularly with the Lunar New Year and the start of the Winter Olympics just around the corner. I mean, we're talking about lockdowns and restrictions on movement in some of the country's largest cities and port hubs, which, really is starting to crimp demand. Overall, however, demand is still robust and stronger than expected and very much on the up. Regarding supply, I mean, within OPEC Plus, we're already seeing several countries in the group struggling to meet their production quotas as dictated by the deal. Some of the usual suspects, Nigeria, Angola, even Malaysia. Which ultimately means that the group is, continuing to under-deliver on its pledged 400,000 barrel per day monthly output additions. According to Argus's own figures, the 19 OPEC and non-OPEC members that participate in the cuts, they delivered 300,000 barrels per day extra to the market in December. Now that's just, 75% of the pledge. But, several consecutive months of under-delivering, that's left them around, I think, 650,000 barrels per day below their collective, cap for December. I mean, that's a gap that looks set to only grow over the coming months. Add to that some unforeseen disruptions and outages in countries that are not participating in the deal, say, in Ecuador and Libya last month. And there's little surprise we're seeing prices as they are. And in terms of geopolitics, I mean, there's been several episodes, some are ongoing, that you'd have to say are contributing to the rise in prices, not least the ongoing tensions between Ukraine and Russia, where, even if we dismiss the threat of military action, I mean, the possibility of sanctions alone on Russia could represent yet another risk to world supply. Beyond that, we've seen, the Houthis in Yemen, they've stepped up their attacks in the region. I mean, most recently to the UAE, which has been the target of 2 separate ballistic missile and drone attacks in the past 2 weeks. I mean, that's effectively opened up a whole new front in the ongoing Yemen war. With, the Houthis, they were previously only really focusing their attacks on Saudi Arabia and on shipping through the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. So, all in all, I mean, I'd say it's difficult to see anything other than oil prices continuing to move up over the coming weeks and months. I mean, there certainly doesn't seem to be anything obvious that would cause, prices to fall.
Okay, that's a lot for OPEC to think about. So how worried are they about all this? How worried are they about this rise in prices?
Well, from what we've been seeing and hearing over the past few weeks, I think the answer to that is, yes, it is a concern for OPEC Plus, but also no. Yes, in that oil prices at or around the $100 per barrel mark, I mean, they're not good for anybody. Oman's oil minister, Hamad al-Rumhi, he said earlier this month or earlier in January that OPEC Plus as a group doesn't really want to see oil at $100 per barrel. I mean, he said the world is not really ready for that. He pointed to the fact that OPEC and its non-OPEC partners, they're now meeting on a monthly basis, and that sort of allows them to keep their hands firmly on the, proverbial wheel and stop the market from overheating. Other OPEC delegates that we've spoken to, they also say the same. But why I also say no here is that there doesn't really also seem to be an overriding sense among these delegates that, at least for the moment, that something needs to be done about it. Or hang on, let me rephrase. There's something that they need to do about it, I mean, why do I say that? These delegates that we've spoken to, several of them have pointed out, they've pointed a very clear geopolitical element to the price rise. They admit that, yes, fundamentals have played a part in the prices rising, supply tightness, concerns over future spare capacity and such. But, that alone, they say that this doesn't explain why the prices are where they are, at around 90. They feel that, the concerns over supply disruptions, either because of what's happening in Russia and Ukraine or in the Middle East, I mean, they feel that's sort of more to blame for the trajectory of the price at the moment, particularly when you consider the importance of these countries. I mean, Russia and the UAE in OPEC plus. And because of this geopolitical element, there's a feeling that this really isn't their problem to fix. As was the case when prices were last in the, say, 80s in October. At that point, they didn't feel the market was necessarily in deficit for them to, produce more. So I think the same can be said for now. So at least for now, I think the sense is that it's better to wait it out.
Okay, so perhaps from the sound of it, we shouldn't really expect them to do too much to counter this. But is this really a question of what they want to do or what they can or can't do?
Right. So that's an interesting question. Essentially, can the group do more than the 400,000 barrels per day in any one month if needed, right? I mean, in theory, within the confines of this deal, you'd have to say no. Now, why? That's because the agreement essentially only really allows them to increase production by, a maximum of 400,000 barrels per day each and every month through to April, and a maximum of 432,000 barrels per day every month beyond that through until September, assuming that the group, doesn't really choose to pause these hikes in any one month. But when you look at the numbers a little bit more closely, as I mentioned before, we see that OPEC Plus as a group, they've in many months really been falling short of actually delivering that 400,000 barrels per day increment. As a reminder, what did we say? In our last August production survey, I mean, we found that the countries that are participating in the deal only delivered 3/4 of the 400,000 barrels per day that they pledged to add. As several countries, kept their output below their ceilings. In some cases, as with Saudi Arabia, for example, sure. I mean, this is intended. But in many other cases, such as, with Nigeria, Angola, Equatorial Guinea, Congo, I mean, this is more down to an inability to produce more. I mean, typically for operational reasons, which are in most cases pretty persistent. I mean, that left the group 650,000 barrels per day below their collective cap in December. And as the group continues to unwind the cut, I mean, this problem is only going to get bigger as more and more countries begin to struggle with, the same thing. So, I mean, what now? So far, several OPEC ministers have dismissed the suggestion or the notion that these countries, those countries with spare capacity, so, the likes of Saudi Arabia, UAE, for example, I mean, that they could compensate for those who are not really able to deliver their own shares of the cuts. They say that, it's every country's right to decide whether to produce that quota or under, and it would essentially be against the spirit of the deal to encroach on another country's quota. That's fair, but I'd argue personally that, I mean, OPEC plus and OPEC before it, they've always found ways around such things in the past, in the sense that when needs must, they've always been able to tweak the rules, rejig the deal, essentially do what's necessary. And there is precedent for this. In the middle of 2018, for example, there was a point when there was, huge overcompliance by the group as a whole, in that several countries were cutting just too much. In many cases, due to reasons that were really out of their control. At that point, the group then decided, those countries with capacity should produce more to compensate for the countries that weren't able to fulfill their own quotas. Admittedly, if such a plan were to be put on the table today, it wouldn't be that popular, with many countries and the group still having, some room to go before they reach their capacity. But further down the road, several months down the line, when a number of more countries are at or close to reaching capacity, I don't think it's beyond the realms of possibility that they once again, revert to that kind of an arrangement if the market is clearly in deficit. So, I'll repeat something I've said many times before. OPEC Plus and OPEC before it, it's nothing if it's not flexible.
Okay, so next week's meeting, let's get into some specifics here. We've got all the sort of backdrop and the kind of OPEC rationale here. What do we think is going to happen next week?
Right. So in terms of the coming meeting, what we're hearing from delegates is that we should really be expecting more of the same. I'm sorry to say this. It feels like I'm doing it every month, but it feels like we're going to get another continuation of the plan, as is, and an agreement to sanction yet another 400,000 barrel per day increase in the overall quota for March. And that's really for many of the reasons I laid out a little earlier. First, again, that there isn't really a feeling at the moment that the market is necessarily in deficit and in need of more crude, but also because really a decision to raise quotas by more than 400,000 barrels per day at a time when the group is already struggling with that volume, or to bring on that volume every month, it would really only end up putting more pressure on the group. So, that said though, of course, with prices being as high as they are at the moment, you can never really discount some 11th hour pressure being placed on the group from Washington to, do more. But save that, I think we're all set for yet another quick and straightforward meeting this month, which, to be honest, it may not be such a bad thing given how complex things are, likely to start looking very soon. These meetings, these short and sweet meetings, they may soon become a thing of the past.
Soon become a thing of the past. Now that's rather intriguing. So why is that? What's on the agenda in the next few months?
Yeah, sure. Look, there's many things to look forward to, but there's one thing in particular that at least I personally find could, cause a little bit of intrigue, confusion, possibly even a bit of tension as well. It's this idea or this decision to issue new higher baselines for 5 of the OPEC Plus group's members. That's going to soon come into effect. If you remember, the group in mid-2021, they agreed to issue new higher baselines to 5 countries. That was Saudi Arabia, Russia, the UAE, Kuwait, and Iraq. This all started after the UAE was pushing for higher baselines in exchange for, an agreement to extend the deal beyond the the original April 2022 expiry. In the end, after a lot of toing and froing, they got given this higher baseline, but that also came with higher baselines for these 4 other countries. Now, in the these new baselines that were agreed, they amounted to a cumulative 1.6 million barrels per day, and they would take effect essentially from May 2022 through until the end of the year. So in the days and weeks following that agreement, there was some confusion among delegates as to what impact that would have come May. There were some delegates who said at the time, and who still say today, that this could actually, translate into a 1.6 million barrel per day hike in May to actually reflect the change in baselines. But others have repeatedly insisted to us, and publicly, that this isn't really the case. They've said that, the purpose of the change in the baselines was essentially to basically protect these countries in the event that new cuts are agreed in the future, in the sense that they would really have to cut from a higher baseline. For what it's worth, as of now, we at Argus, we're of the understanding that the change will not essentially translate into an additional 1.6 million barrels per day of supply. But with some delegates still unsure, I'd say it's certainly one to watch.
Okay, well, that certainly will be, I think, an intriguing issue for the next few months. That is quite a volume of oil, but as you say, far from clear that that's really what that means. Okay, well, look, Nader, thank you as ever for your time today. Let's give us a good steer on what to expect next week. If you want to keep up to date with our in-depth OPEC news and analysis, then why not subscribe to Argus Global Markets or Petroleum Argus, or indeed both. You can find more information on these services at www.argusmedia.com. So thanks for tuning in, and we look forward to you joining us on the next episode of the Crude Report.